It's the morning of August 6th, 2012. We're at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University. I'm Michael Aron, Chief Political Correspondent of NJTV. We're here this morning to begin a series of interviews with former Governor Jim Florio about his time as governor, how he got to be governor, what he accomplished as governor. We're probably going to do this in 3 or 4 or 5 sessions, but we're going to start at the beginning, how he got involved and interested in politics. Governor Florio, good morning.
Good morning.
Let's begin with how you got interested in politics. At what time in your life did you begin to feel an interest in politics?
Well, when I was in college, at Trenton State Teachers College, I ran for student government president, and I was elected. I was impressed with the whole process of getting elected, persuading people. I went to graduate school at Columbia in the area of public law and government. And I had intended to actually be an academic political scientist. But while I was in school, Richard Neustadt, which is a fairly prominent political scientist, came back from the Kennedy administration and inspired me, among other people I suspect, to actually not teach about government, to go become involved in government. I decided if I was going to be involved in government, I guess I had to be a lawyer, which of course was not the case, but I didn't know any better at the time. So I went to Rutgers Law School in Camden, moved down to Camden, 1963. Had to work for a year to earn the money to go to law school. But in 1964, I enrolled in Rutgers Law School and also became involved with local politics in Camden City at that point. And it was a traditional, old-style political machine. And I wrote a letter to the mayor, Mayor Pierce at the time, and said that I wanted to get involved, but I couldn't find anybody who would be willing to open the doors for me. He was very responsive, sent the local ward leader around to talk with me, and we got off very well. We hit it off very well. A fellow named Armand Paglione, who was the 12th district ward leader. And he asked me if I would be willing to be the district leader, which is a subset of the ward.
How old were you?
I was about 23, 24. And so I said yes. So while I was going to law school, I was also the district leader in the political organization, registered all my 600 voters in the district very diligently, and came to work in the Young Democrats at the same time. So by the time I got out of law school, I already had some inklings of being involved with politics.
Trenton State Teachers College is today the College of New Jersey.
That's right. And by the way, the tuition at that point was $150 a year.
Richard Neustadt was pretty famous for his book on presidential politics.
Yeah. Very impressive book in terms of the concentration, the difference between power, the perception of it, and the reality of it. And the conclusion of the book is that the president's power really is the power of the pulpit, the power to persuade. But he spends most of his time trying to get people who work for him to do what he's supposed to be doing, what they're supposed to be doing. So it's a really interesting book.
Let's go back even farther. You grew up in Brooklyn?
Yes.
That's the legend anyway.
Yes, it's true.
Your father and mother?
My father was a shipyard worker, worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. How I got to New Jersey was the Brooklyn Navy Yard closed. And my father started working out of the Hoboken shipyards and the Bayonne shipyards at the time.
When you were how old?
When I was a teenager. When I was 17, while I still lived in Brooklyn, I quit high school and I joined the Navy. I went into the Navy. I got my GED diploma while I was in service. And when I got out of the service, I was a Jersey person. My parents had moved to Lake Apatcon, to a summer house that they converted into a winter house. But when I got out of high school, when I got out of the service rather, I also went to Trenton State Teachers College.
What'd you do? Where'd you go in the service? Where did the Navy take you?
I was a weatherman. I was a meteorologist. I spent 2 years in Kodiak, Alaska, and 2 years in Key West, Florida.
And again, part of the Florio legend is that you fought with your fists in the Navy. Is that?
I did. I was a boxer in the Navy. Interesting life. Not that I want to ever do that for a full-time job, but actually it helps you in politics know how to dodge punches.
So you decided to go to law school. You went to Camden from Lake Hopatcong. That had been your home, Lake Hopatcong?
Well, I really never lived there. My parents lived there. But when I got into the service, I went right to college.
Okay. College of New Jersey, Columbia, Rutgers Law School, and you're now a district leader in Camden.
Right.
What was the Camden, was it a machine? You say
it was an old-fashioned political organization.
Was it honest?
I'm sorry?
Was it honest?
Was it honest? As far as I knew it was, but I mean, honesty was defined in different ways in those days. I mean, there was money distributed to district leaders, some of which got to the people it was supposed to get to. It was an old-fashioned organization.
Successful?
Very successful down there at that point, yes. Largely based in the city of Camden, though. The suburban areas are all Republican, and that has changed over the years, obviously. But it was a political organization. There was an old fellow, Mayor Bruner, who was one of the political bosses on a statewide basis. If you read through New Jersey political history about the 40s and the 50s, Mayor Bruner was one of the big deals.
Was he a Camden mayor?
Camden mayor.
At some point, the machine became the Ericetti machine. At what point, do you recall?
Well, around the early 70s, it became Mayor Ericetti was a city director of Public Works, if I recall correctly. Then he became the city political boss. Then he became political mayor, and then he became the state senator.
Right. And then he got caught up in abscam around 1980, 81, and his career was kind of ruined.
Ended.
And his reputation.
Yeah, he went to jail.
He went to jail. At some point, you decided to run for the legislature. Tell us about that.
1969. It was interesting because I had just been out of law school a very short period of time, and it was easy to get the nomination because nobody wanted it. That was the year, you may recall, that Governor Cahill got elected. Governor Cahill was a very popular congressman in Camden County, South Jersey, the 1st District. And everyone anticipated it was going to be a big Republican year, and it was. And so nobody wanted to run in a district that was going to be losing. I did, because I didn't know any better. And I won by, I think, like 160 votes or something of that sort, very small margin. Reverend Woodson from Trenton and I and fellow John Horn, who was my running mate, were the only Democrats elected south of Trenton that year. It was a Republican landslide.
John Horn, who would become a cabinet officer in the Byrne administration.
That's correct. So I was actually, while I was in law school, I was a staff person. In those days, they didn't really have great staffs, but they had a little bit of money. They provided to some staff people. And I'd go to the legislature with John when he was in office. And I learned a bit about the legislature. And then the next year, as soon as I graduated from law school, there was an opening there, and I ran for it, and I was elected.
Do you remember how you presented yourself to the voters that first time out?
Yeah, I was very active in the Young Democrats, and therefore I was out there doing a whole lot of things. I'd show up at Kiwanis meetings and Chamber of Commerce meetings and things of that sort. So I actively solicited opportunities to go out and talk to people, which in those days was not the norm. Under the old machine system, all you had to do was get the support of the bosses, and they delivered the vote. I sort of, was a little bit ahead of the times. I said, I'm going to go out and develop my own constituency. I was involved in environmental matters before anybody really paid attention to environmental matters. Had the support of some of the environmental groups, and started to develop my own sort of cadre of folks who were enthusiastic about the things I was talking about.
Who else did you say besides John Horn?
Reverend Woodson.
Reverend Woodson in Trenton.
Became the speaker.
The first African-American speaker of the State Assembly. Did you present yourself as an anti-machine candidate or a reform candidate, or wasn't it necessary at that time?
I tried to present myself as a substantive candidate, somebody that knew something about some of the issues, and went out and was fairly successful in the suburban areas particularly, because that was not what people expected out of city politicians.
What were you doing for a living at this time?
Well, at that point I had my own law practice that I just started. I think my first year I made $6,000 as a single practitioner, doing a lot of night court work and that sort of thing.
Did politics help the law business?
I suspect probably so, a little bit, in terms of just people knowing who you were. I remember a woman writer for the Philadelphia Magazine came and interviewed me as a new, young assemblyman and wrote this nice story in the magazine about me. And she asked me in my little office that I had, what is the nature of your practice? I had to grovel around for a couple of minutes to think about what it was, and I had a divorce matter on my desk. So I said, I'm a divorce lawyer, which I had a couple of cases. But she wrote it up. As a result of that, I started getting divorce cases as a result of the magazine article.
Were you married yet?
I was. I had 3 children.
Already had 3 children by that point.
Well, I worked my way through law school as a night watchman at Woodrow Wilson High School. I worked, I can't remember how much money I made, but not a whole lot. But I worked from 6 o'clock at night till 2 o'clock in the morning. That was how I earned my living.
Woodrow Wilson High School still exists there in Camden.
Yes, yes. Yeah. I just drove by my house, 62 South 28th Street in Camden. It's in a little bit of disarray.
What caused you to just drive by?
I drove by because I was a part of a program with the mayor the other day about a program with the Regional Plan Association that I'm involved with, trying to do some rehabilitation in the East Camden neighborhood, which is where I'm from.
How did you find the legislature?
Well, it's obviously intriguing for me, not knowing a whole lot about the political process. But it was good. The frustrating part was that there was no staff. It was not a particularly well-developed committee system, so you were effectively on your own. Being diligent and being idealistic and conscientious, I spent a lot of time in the library, doing my own research, so I would make decisions that were right. Took on a couple of different issues. Tenants' rights was one of the issues I was involved with. Some of the environmental issues I became involved with as well. But it was frustrating having no staff and having to do your own research, which was interesting because when I went to Congress, totally different, in a much better way.
And today they say that the legislature is much more like Congress in terms of
That's
staffing
right.
and support.
Well, it's true.
Were there committees in those days? And
There were committees.
Did you sit on? Do you remember what you sat on?
I became the chairman of the State Government Committee, which, interestingly enough,
In the Assembly?
Of the Assembly. I was there for 6 years. I got elected 3 times. So I became the chairman at one point. And one of the most memorable occasions I remember was the redistricting that took place, congressional redistricting. In those days, the legislature did it. I remember being called and wooed by a whole bunch of congressmen telling me how important they were and that it was essential that their districts be preserved. And I've always remembered that.
Who was the congressman from your part of the state at that time?
At that point, Congressman John Hunt, who I subsequently was victorious over.
He was a Republican?
He was a Republican, very conservative fellow, former sheriff, former state policeman, law and order. And I ran against him in 1972 and lost.
You were in a hurry.
Well, the opportunities presented themselves, and I took advantage of the opportunities. 72, as you may recall, was the McGovern-Nixon year when the Democrats got totally wiped out. And interesting enough, I lost, but I lost by a fairly small margin. And so that set me up for the next time to run.
Today, that part of the state is just so solidly Democratic, but you say that in that time, the city of Camden was Democrat and the surrounding suburbs leaned Republican?
And the rural parts of Gloucester County were rock rib Republican. I was the first Democrat elected in 102 years in the 1st Congressional District. Wow. So you're right, it's changed dramatically over the last 20, 30 years or so.
Did you get anything done? You were in the minority in the Cahill years, right?
In the Cahill years, actually, no. Oh, in the first time it was. But I was in the Cahill years, I was in the minority. But we got a whole lot done. In those days, there was much less partisanship. So there was much collaboration, more than is the case now.
Why do you think that is?
You haven't got the time to go into it. Money, consultants really I would blame the most. Consultants who are interested exclusively in elections, not in governing. So the advice they give to win an election almost precludes effective governing.
So you ran for the Assembly in '69. You got sworn in '70, and by '72 you already had your sights set on federal office.
True.
And then came Watergate. How did that affect you?
Well, that was obviously the thing that helped. I mean, in the '72 election that I lost, I was beaten up by the incumbent congressman as being in favor of the 3 A's: abortion, amnesty, and acid drugs. So that was sort of the standard line that year against Democrats.
Amnesty for draft dodgers?
For draft dodgers, right. The Vietnam War, we were coming out of the Vietnam War. So it was an interesting turnaround. But then I did well. I did a lot of retail campaigning, doing coffee klatches. I got to be known as the coffee klatch congressman. Because someone would say to me, I want to help you, I like you. Well, put 20 people in your living room next Wednesday. I'll bring the donuts and the coffee, and we'll talk. So I did that enough, and I ended up doing it in my congressional career as well. And after a while, we converted the district over to a very strong Democratic district, doing that sort of retail politics.
Did you enjoy that part of it?
Very much so. Really one of the most enjoyable parts of my life.
So you beat Mr. Hunt in what year?
1974.
74. The post-Watergate.
Well, that was the Watergate issue. That year, you may recall, President Nixon resigned in August of that year. In November, the Republican Party got wiped out.
When do you think the thought of running for governor occurred?
Well, in 1977, you may recall that Governor Byrne was not doing well in the polls. And there was a lot of speculation that he would not even run. And so I said, if he's not going to run, maybe I should give some thought to running. I'm very conscious of South Jersey, was really the area I was from. And there was this sense that somehow South Jersey was not getting its fair share of things. And so I was going to run as a South Jersey candidate. And I didn't really know what I was doing for the most part. I proved it in the course of the campaign, that I didn't know what I was doing in running a primary. But what really prompted me to run was the expectation that Governor Byrne would not run. I actually approached Governor Byrne when I even started thinking about it. And I said, Governor Byrne, I will support you, but if you're not going to run, I'm more interested in running. And he very cleverly, and we've joked about this over the years, very cleverly sort of led me on, saying, well, I don't know, I don't think so, but who knows, whatever. And they kept on doing that right up to the very end. And at the end, when he said he was going to run, I had already been totally committed intellectually and had people supporting me so that I ran. I later found out, and Dick Leone, who's a good friend, recounted to me, as well as Governor Byrne, there was a conscious effort on their part that the governor's popularity was not as great as it could be. In a primary race with 7 people or 8 people in it, he could win, which is what he did, with a very small number, but with 8 people dividing up the vote. That was a good thing. So they were encouraging me to run without really telling me so.
What caused him such difficulty in that first term was his commitment to passing an income tax.
Right.
Where had you been on that issue?
Well, actually, I was out of the Congress by the time that they finally voted. Out of the legislature by the time they voted. So I really didn't say a whole lot about what my thoughts were about it. I'm not sure really I would have been down. Now, obviously, it was the right thing to do. But at the time, I was much younger and probably a little bit less responsible. I'm not sure how I would have voted.
You didn't have to give up your congressional seat to run in the Democratic gubernatorial primary.
That's right. So what I did do is learn what not to do. So in 1977, I learned how to lose a primary, and I learned how to win it after that. So I won the primary in 1981 when I subsequently ran.
That's interesting. 77, you learned how to lose a primary. 81, you learned how to win a primary, but
lose a
general. And 89, you put it all together.
Right. But while I was in Washington, I was doing a lot of fairly important things. I enjoyed the time in Congress. It was a great learning experience. Learned a lot while I was there and got some substantive things done.
Like?
Well, many of the environmental laws. I was very much involved with that. I was very much involved with railroads. And many of the railroad laws, the privatization of Conrail, the preservation of railroad retirement. I still have a great number of people who are friends from my railroad days, and I have a nice reputation with some of those folks because we preserved, as you may not remember, the railroad industry in the country was on the verge of going into bankruptcy. The whole railroad industry was falling apart. I was the chairman of the committee that dealt with railroad jurisdiction, so we were able to put together a system that today is a very good system.
A rail system or a retirement system?
A rail system and a retirement system. The rail retirement system was there under the Reagan administration. There was an effort to break it up. And so we preserved that, and a lot of the railroad retirees, as you can appreciate, were very appreciative of that.
Environmentally, we all remember Superfund, and you were clearly identified as, I guess, the author of the Superfund law.
Yeah.
That was in the late 70s, or?
That was in the Superfund was the late 70s under President Carter.
Under President Carter.
Actually, it was the last bill that President Carter signed before he left office.
Really?
Yeah.
What other environmental law?
The Pinelands was something that I initiated in Washington to provide for the Pinelands to be designated as a federal reserve, so as to give it the authority to be able to be preserved. Also then giving the state of New Jersey the authority to create a system whereby a Pinelands Commission was created, and Governor Byrne did a very good job with Senator Merlino being the key person down there. And it was very contentious.
Senator Merlino was the Democratic Senate President at the time?
That's correct.
Governor Byrne considers preserving the Pinelands as probably his signature legacy.
With justification.
Somehow in my mind, it seems like it was a two-step process. He got it done at the state level first, and then you and he came in behind that and federalized it?
No, just the opposite.
Just the opposite?
Yeah, the federal level had to be authorized first. In other words, in order to put the system together, you had to have federal legislation to be able to authorize the area to be designated as a federal preserve, which is a conscious designation which allows for states to come in and put in systems to make sure that the preservation takes place. And that's the way it worked. We passed the federal legislation, very controversial. A lot of the real estate industry people were very unhappy about that because they had planned to develop all of the Pinelands. And so you may recall that there was a South Jersey secessionist movement that was really sparked by that. There was some allegations that, oh, this was a North Jersey plot to take all the water from South Jersey aquifers and pump it either to Philadelphia or to pump it up to North Jersey. It was a less than rational approach, but it was a politically powerful movement.
Did it cause you political difficulties?
Probably resulted in my losing the '81 election. As you may recall, the election was lost by 1,797 votes, which is a number that sticks in my mind indelibly. So I suspect we probably lost a number of votes as a result of that.
You say that you embraced the cause of South Jersey, which often felt, and still does, that it gets the short end of the stick relative to North Jersey, and yet Governor Cahill came out of Camden County. Didn't he redress the imbalance to some degree?
Well, there wasn't a sense that he was able to get a whole lot done. Not because of him, but because of inter-party squabbles on the Republican side. You may recall Governor Cahill lost the Republican primary as a sitting governor by Congressman Sandman, who was extremely conservative. And it mirrors what's happening now in the Republican Party, only now it's much more accelerated. The difference between sort of moderate Republicans, which was Governor Cahill, and very right-wing conservative candidates, which I think was represented by Senator Sandman.
Did you have much contact with Cahill when you were in the legislature?
Yes, unfortunately it wasn't a pleasant contact, but it was a contact. He was very unhappy about some of the things that I had said in the newspapers. And Governor Cahill who became a good friend, was very emotional about criticism. And I didn't think my criticism was particularly harsh, but I did criticize the administration.
For what, do you recall?
Some policies that I thought were not doing well by urban areas, because he was being obviously leaned on by Republican suburban legislators. So I just thought he was not really doing everything for Camden that should be the case. I remember being called into his office one Monday morning. Legislature met in Monday in those days. And he was waving a piece of paper. And he said, "Have you this yours?" And I said, "I don't know what it is." And it was a cutout of a newspaper, a letter to the editor that I had written. And he said, "This is something you want to be my enemy, don't you?" I said, "No, I'd like to be your friend." But he said, "Well, then you don't write things like this." I said, "I don't write? You're telling me I can't write things? I mean, you should not be paranoid." And when I said paranoid, he went off the wall. So he became very red-faced and unhappy. And for a number of years, we didn't have any relationship. But then later on, we became very good friends. And he was actually very supportive. I never asked him who he actually voted for, but I suspect if push comes to shove, he probably voted for me.
Over Tom Kean in 81?
No, not 81.
Or over Tim Porter in 89.
Right. But he was a blue-collar guy, ex-FBI agent, law enforcement person. Very nice man.
You say that Brendan Byrne and his right-hand man, Dick Leone, sort of baited you into that running for governor in 77? Fair?
Well, they've acknowledged it. I mean, it's very clever, very smart.
Uh-huh.
I mean, probably if it had been one-on-one, if you may recall, Congressman Rowe was the most formidable of the opponents in 81 to Governor Byrne. I really don't think if it had been one-on-one, Governor Byrne versus Congressman Rowe, probably Congressman Rowe would have won.
In 77, you mean?
I'm 77.
Yeah. One-on-one, Byrne couldn't have won, but one-on-7...
I suspect not. One-on-7, he was able to win. You may recall, I think he had 3 or 4 of his own cabinet members ran against him, which is kind of unprecedented.
Yes, certainly was.
Yeah.
Wouldn't be tolerated today.
I suspect not.
Did you put together a campaign team? Did you have a campaign manager? Did you raise a lot of money? Or?
Well, no, raised no money, virtually no money. Matter of fact, when I ran for Congress, I mean, I got elected. The first time I ran, I raised $12,000 and lost. Second time I ran and won with $90,000, which is kind of interesting. Nowadays, you can't run for council for that kind of money at the local level. But what I did is had a number of people who were supportive of me in South Jersey. Actually, they all still reminisce about how the bus trips, they would go up to the places in North Jersey and knock on doors and do the same type of things I did in Congress, running on a statewide basis, which of course you can't do. So the answer is no, we had no real organization.
Run that by me again. I didn't quite grasp that. What happened?
In 77, we had a group of fairly loyal supporters from South Jersey, who were my supporters.
Right.
So rather than have a statewide organization, I just took the supporters from South Jersey, got into buses, and went around North Jersey, which of course was hopelessly naive, and the results demonstrated that.
That's a pretty primitive way of trying to get a message out.
Primitive is kind.
You could just as easily have taken a look at the U.S. Senate as the governorship. Did you look at the U.S. Senate as well?
No.
Why not?
Well, I was in the Congress, and I went to be governor, and the governor was what I focused on.
Why? Many House members move up to the U.S. Senate.
Well, again, it's the difference between legislative authority and executive authority. I had seen the benefits and the limitations of legislative authority in the legislature as well as in the Congress, and wanted to try my hand at being an executive. And there are differences between those, and I thought the executive would be much more interesting for me to be able to influence events, which of course is the motivation for being involved in the whole process as well. And over and above that, in interacting with the senators, I really had sort of not a condescending approach to senators, but just the idea that members of the House, because they're much more specialized, are much more impressive in the depth of what they go into. They're limited in what they go into. So if you're involved with the environment or railroads or whatever you're involved with, you have much more depth than a senator does, because a senator has more of a scope of things. So I was much more into depth than I was into scope at that period of time.
Who were our senators in the 70s? Harrison Williams?
Clifford Case, Harrison
Case.
Williams, Bill Bradley ultimately, Bob Torselli ultimately, and Senator Laudenberg as well.
Did you have any personal relationships with any of them?
Well, Bill Bradley was the reason I broke with the Democratic organization in South Jersey. You may recall in the first campaign that he ran for Senate against the organization effort, which was on behalf of Dick Leone. The Governor Byrne wanted Dick Leone, Angelo Ericetti wanted Dick Leone, everybody wanted Dick Leone. And they told me, as the congressman, I was a young congressman at that point, that I had to go along with them. At that point, I really didn't care very much for Dick Leone, who's become a good, fast friend. But in those days, I guess we were all young and arrogant. He happened to be young and particularly arrogant at the point. He's mellowed over the years. So I just said I was not supporting him. The organization in Camden said, well, if you're not supporting him, we're going to throw you off the ticket. I said, well, throw me off the ticket and I'll run my own line, run my own campaign.
This is 78.
This is 78. And so what happened is I ran my own line, but then they discouraged me from doing that by saying, we'll give you your own line, we will challenge you, but you can't run with the freeholders, you can run with Bradley and that's all. So Bradley and I won, and obviously he won the state and he won Camden County overwhelmingly. So that was my first open break with the political organization in Camden. That was subsequently followed up the next year when I ran a whole line of candidates for freeholder and assembly and was successful, and therefore the people who had been in the old machine sort of moved on.
Was Lewis Katz with you, or was he?
He was with me.
He was with you.
Yeah.
Did you have a Dick Leone type yet in your political life? A right-hand man, a fellow, someone who helped you think things through?
Not at that point. Later on, I picked up some people, but for the most part, it was by the seat of my pants.
And you knew you were still what, in your late 20s or early 30s at this point?
Late 20s.
Yeah.
Late 20s.
And you knew that being governor would be more satisfying than being a U.S. senator.
Well, it was going to be different, and I knew that executive power is much more focused. I mean, you may not have the same depth that you can go into as a legislator, but you have more authority, more scope, and of course, as we all know, the governorship in New Jersey has the most power of any governorship in the country. So I was interested in taking on responsibility as an executive.
And I find what you say about the difference between a senator and a House member interesting. I've never heard that before.
Well, I tease my friends in the Congress that they can go pontificate about all they want to, but they have no responsibility for implementing. On the other hand, governors, mayors, presidents, executives, they are held to responsibility for everything. So that's the big difference.
How about Congress as compared to the state legislature? How did that compare?
No comparison. I mean, in the Congress, you have access to information beyond your capability of absorbing. I mean, it's very satisfying. As a congressman particularly, and I was very early on a chairman, one of the things that reforms...
What was your committee?
I was a committee on dealing with healthcare, dealing rather with environmental matters, transportation, jurisdiction over commerce, which of course is a broad topic. And jurisdiction in the Congress works by the parliamentarians' rulings as to whether the title of your committee encompasses what you want to deal with. By virtue of having jurisdiction over matters of commerce, you have jurisdiction over everything if you're creative enough. So we were creative. I had hearings on boxing, I had hearings on the Federal Trade Commission, a whole lot of areas. So I was very expansive in our jurisdiction.
Why did you have hearings on boxing?
It's a matter of commerce. Boxing is in commerce. So all you have to
Were
do
there
is,
problems with boxing back then?
Oh, yeah, absolutely were. There were problems, and there still are, in terms of the way it's managed, the way it's organized, the way boxers are dealt with, no pension systems, things of that sort. So yes, there are. But I guess the point I wanted to make was that in the House of Representatives particularly, seniority was eliminated. One of the reforms that the Watergate people, myself included, put into effect was that you didn't have to only advance by seniority. The way it was before that, you'd have to be there for 30 years before you became a chairman of a committee. We made it much more democratic with a small g, and you could compete and seek election to chairmanship. I was there for about 2 years, and I competed for a chairmanship, and was successful.
A full committee or a subcommittee?
Oh, the subcommittee. So, and the seniority was for subcommittees and full committee memberships.
You mentioned hearings on boxing and one other topic. I don't remember.
We had insurance. I had jurisdiction over insurance because we argued that that was in commerce. And frankly, there's nothing that's not in commerce. So that we had a good ability, and I had a fellow, Greg Lawler, who was my staff person in the committee, who was very, very good at making arguments as to why we had jurisdiction over all the things we wanted to have jurisdiction over.
Insurance would become a big topic in your governorship,
yes.
And Greg Lawler, 14, 15 years later, would go to work on some of those issues with
and
you.
The ironic part of it, which is troubling to some, particularly in the insurance industry, is the federal government doesn't have a whole lot of jurisdiction over insurance, because for the most part, insurance is a state-regulated entity. We made the argument that there were some aspects of insurance that did have federal ramifications, and therefore laws that we wanted to improve upon had jurisdiction for our committee.
So you were fairly aggressive as a congressman?
Yes.
In tackling issues? And
creative is what we put it.
Creative. Having broken with the party establishment on the Bradley-Leon race,
right.
Did that endear you to Bill Bradley? Did you come to have a close relationship?
We had a working relationship with Bill. He was very helpful to us in getting the Pinelands bill passed. He was very helpful on the Superfund on the Senate side. As a matter of fact, we had a couple of problems at the end that we had to get done. We got it done, both bills done in the House fairly early on, but the Senate is much more difficult. So I worked very closely with him on those types of issues particularly.
It was also, you say, your first serious break with the party establishment in Camden County, which by this point was pretty much controlled by Angelo Arricchetti,
right.
who was both the mayor and a state senator.
Correct.
And was he county chairman as well?
He was effective de facto county chairman. He was not the title, but he really ran the county.
So a year or two later, when he falls afoul of the law in Abscam, conveniently, you've already broken with him. Is that
well? That's
fair
the case. But actually, even before that, I mean, we had effective control of the political effort, and then we brought in a whole lot of good people.
Like who?
Lou Greenwald's mother, Mayor Barnaby Greenwald.
Maria Barnaby Greenwald, mayor of
we
Cherry Hill.
Actually, we advertised for candidates in the paper. When we were saying we were opening the process, we advertised. She applied. I remember going to her house, and little Louis was there, and she gave me a piece of cheesecake because I told her I liked cheesecake, and she had made a cheesecake. And we attracted a whole lot of very, very good people.
So was the Democratic Party divided at that point between the regulars and the reformers?
Well, by that point, the regulars were slipping off into obscurity. So it really was a fairly quick turnover of authority.
Was Rob Andrews around yet?
Rob Andrews is around. He was a young man. Rob Andrews and Joe Roberts were two young men from Belmar, one of the towns down there. Both of them worked with me as campaign volunteers. Joe Roberts ultimately worked as a staff person in my campaign office. And both of them became freeholders and went on to Congress and Speaker of the General Assembly. But those are the type of people we attracted to politics. And as a result of that, we converted Camden County, which had been Republican, into a Democratic stronghold.
Were you the leader?
I had no titles, but I mean, people ran on our ticket, yes.
Tell me a little more about how in the House of Representatives the seniority system changed. You say it was the post-Watergate generation that said we're not going to tolerate the old system?
The year of our election, we changed the rules. In other words, we got elected in November of 1974, and in the organizing of the next Congress, we changed all the rules.
And said, how did the rules change?
Well, the rules changed because it was not automatically seniority. There were going to be contested elections for chairman of the full committee and chairman of the subcommittees.
So you had to run for the chairmanship of your subcommittee.
Yes.
When you decided to run in the crowded 1977 gubernatorial primary, how did you position yourself? What were those people from South Jersey getting on a bus and going up to North Jersey? What was the message?
Well, the message was I delivered in Congress. I've been in Congress now for a couple of years, 3 years or so, and I could bring the same type of skills to the state. It's a very, not particularly depth-loaded message. It was a lot of retail stuff. I mean, I was trying to do the same type of thing I'd done in Congress or in the legislature, by getting out, meeting people, trying to convince them that I knew what I was talking about. I wasn't grotesque or offensive, that I would just go and try to convince them that I knew what I was talking about.
How old would you have been in 1977? What year were you born?
1937.
Born in 37, so you were 40 years old.
40 years old.
Which is not too young to, I mean, John Degnan ran for governor at 34, right. So you were ready in terms of life.
Oh, I was ready, but the fact of the matter is there was just much I didn't know about a whole lot of things. I mean, I'm fairly substantive on subject matter matters, but the politics of the state I was totally naive about in 1977. I remember going up to meet with the chairman in Essex County. I forget what his name was, but he was an older fellow who was there a long period of time. And he took me to the Newark Club, the old Newark Club, not the new one that's there now. And he was someone who had a reputation as being a big drinker. I was not a big drinker. And he had a triple bourbon for lunch. And he said, you should have something to drink. I said, well, I'll have a Coke or whatever I ordered. He said, no. When you drink with me, you have to drink real drinks. So I had whatever I had, a whiskey of some sort. Didn't agree with me very much, but that just told me how much I didn't know about how you campaign around the state.
That man's name will pop into my head at some point in the next half hour.
I remember, just as another aside, a story, the chairman in Edison, who was a big political leader in Middlesex County, was a used car salesman. And I remember, I'm a guy who was in the Congress. I think, some minimum degree of deference ought to be given to a congressman. There was no deference given at all. While he was selling cars, he made me sit there for about an hour while I went in to try to urge him that he should be supportive of me. So it was a humbling experience.
So you learned how to interact with people you hadn't been forced to interact with up to that point in time.
Particularly old-fashioned people whose time was just about expiring were still in positions of authority in those years. I mean, even in the legislature, when I was in the legislature, the state was much more urban-oriented. I mean, a couple of the counties would get together, the political leaders in Passaic, Essex, Hudson, maybe Union, Middlesex, would get together, and the 5 or 6 people would make policy. And they'd make phone calls to the legislature, and the legislators would all do what they were told. That was a different time. I mean, clearly that's changed now.
Has it changed so much now? There's an argument could be made that there are still the South Jersey Democratic machine, the Essex County Democratic machine, and that they can instruct legislators to pass something.
You have repositories of that sort of thing, but for the vast majority of people, the vast majority of legislators, almost to a fault, one could argue, they're independent players. Independent players who in some respects preclude some minimum degree of cohesion so as to be able to get things done. So it has changed.
So you weren't afraid in '77 that by challenging a sitting governor that you would hurt your career?
I don't even think I thought about it that much. I mean, over the course of my career, I've done a whole lot of things on instinct. For the most part, it worked out reasonably well, but I'm not sure I calculated it that correctly. And of course, every candidate that runs thinks they have a chance of winning, notwithstanding the reality of the facts on the ground. So at that point, I thought I would replicate what I was able to do in Camden County on a statewide basis, as I said, that was hopelessly naive.
Did you hurt yourself in any way politically
No, I
by
don't
running?
think so. I don't
Did you
think
help
so.
yourself by running?
Probably so, because I think we all know that New Jersey is a difficult state to campaign in, and just so many people have run twice. In my case, I ran 3 times. So you get to be, people have a much more comfortable feeling with you. When they get to meet you and work with you, maybe. I mean, if you're particularly offensive and not very good at interacting with people, then it doesn't help you. But if you make sense, it does help you to be exposed to people.
You had ceased practicing law by the time you were in Congress?
In Congress, that's right.
Yeah. How were your relations with Brendan Byrne after the 77
Fine.
primary?
As a matter of fact, I can remember going up to see Governor Byrne with a lot of the labor people from my area, and which is interesting because recently there was a medical school just dedicated down in South Jersey. That whole medical school initiative was launched in the mid-70s by myself and a number of other people as part of an effort to bring a veterans hospital to South Jersey. The veterans hospital and the medical school were part of one big project. And what we did under the Carter administration was get money for the veterans hospital with anticipated promise of the medical school coming as well. We went up and saw Governor Byrne to get his support for it, and he was supportive. But then, of course, the administration changed in Washington, and the Reagan administration took away the money. And so the Veterans Hospital never occurred. It's taken all this time to get the medical school created down there.
But Byrne was cooperative up to the point that he could be
very
helpful.
cooperative. And frankly, as I said, he wasn't unhappy. He was very happy that I ran. So I guess in some respects, he might regard me as helpful to him inadvertently.
And when did you start thinking, okay, there's another gubernatorial election in 4 years, and I'm going to run in that one?
Pretty right away.
Pretty right away.
Yeah. I thought I'd gained enough knowledge about what not to do in a primary election that I could overcome that and put together around the state people who were friends, who I had developed a relationship with, and who were all more inclined to think about the new politics. I mean, the old machine folks were disappearing, and people, George Zoffinger up in Sussex County, Mike Perucci in Warren County, people who have become friends of mine and supporters over the years, were people who became the new generation of political leaders.
So did you start running right away, would you say?
Well, I didn't start running right away because my philosophy has always been that substance drives politics. So while I was in Washington, I was able to do substantive things which were helpful to me in terms of getting things done, accomplishments that I could brag about a little bit. And then over and above that, there were things that were being done were benefiting New Jersey as well. For example, on the environment. You may recall in the mid-'80s, we had environmental problems at the Jersey Shore. Hypodermic needles washing up, sewage sludge coming. I was working on Superfund for the national basis, but also New Jersey had more Superfund sites than any other state in the Union. My congressional district had more Superfund sites than any other district in the Union. So I was able to do 2 things at one point. As you observed before, I became involved with insurance issues. Insurance issues resonated very well in New Jersey at that period of time. So while doing my job in Washington, I was also advancing my goals in the state as well.
What were the 3 most important congressional accomplishments or issues in terms of being able to present yourself to the state in '81 as a leader?
Well, I would say the environmental issues, the insurance issues, and open space preservation issues, which I've always thought was important as well. I mean, much of the movement on my part, and many other people as well, on the Pinelands was, as you may recall, in that period of time, there was serious discussion about drilling for oil off the coast of New Jersey. And the pipelines from that oil that would be drilled there would have to go to the Delaware River, to the refineries that were there. This concern was, legitimately, if you had an oil spill out of those pipelines, the freshwater aquifer, the underground reservoir, provides the drinking water for all of South Jersey. You start having oil in it, you just contaminate the drinking water systems. So that's why I wanted to, and other people wanted to, preserve the Pinelands free from that sort of development.
So you declared your candidacy for governor in 81. I suppose you did it in early 81. Do you recall doing it?
I do. I think it was in Cherry Hill somewhere.
And how many people ran to be Brendan Burns' successor on the Democratic
side? It was big,
side?
and there was a lot of enthusiasm.
A lot of people,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah. It was a big race. I mean, it was a big primary contest, but I won fairly substantially. Again, Bob Rowe, who's a friend, was an adversary at that point as well. But we, unlike some subsequent primaries between colleagues, ours was very collegial.
Unlike some.
Unlike more recent ones.
Now that I'm thinking about it, that was the year that there were so many candidates for governor on both sides.
That's right. Yeah.
That at New Jersey Monthly Magazine, where I was at the time, we put a sardine can on the cover and laid each candidate.
I think there were 7 or 8 on the Democratic side and 6 or 7 on the Republican side.
I think it was even more than that.
Yeah, maybe.
Who was your most serious challenger or rival for the nomination?
Bob Rowe, Congressman Rowe. Yeah, he had a good base of people, construction trades unions, and it broke down almost north-south. A lot of the union people were supporters of mine in the southern part of the state. He got a lot of the supporters in the northern part of the state.
How'd you beat him?
A lot of retail, building a good organization of people who normally don't get involved in politics. Many of the people I talked to you about before, who we brought into the process, we were able to reach out to people who were not normally involved in primaries. Environmental people, consumer safety people, issues that I was involved with in Washington, we were able to bring people in who normally don't get involved.
Meanwhile, Tom Kean was winning on the Republican side.
Right.
Did you know Tom Kean?
I knew him from the legislature. When I was a staff person in the legislature, he was there. He was speaker at one point. He was in the legislature when I was in the legislature as well. We knew each other, but we didn't interact that much.
How did you think your legislative and congressional experience would serve you in the governor's office?
Well, understanding the legislative process is a very key to a whole lot of success that we had. The legislative process is something that you have to master. It's not automatic. The thing that I did, I guess somewhat uniquely, was to appreciate the fact that the inside players are really very much influenced by the outside players. So I went and played a lot to the outside players. I mean,
what do you mean by the inside players are influenced a lot?
Well, for example, in Congress, the inside players would be my members of my committee, and then the members of the full committee, then the members of the House. Putting together literally a book on inside players. John Jones is very much involved with environmental issues. Frank Smith is a union guy. Someone else is someone who just hates government. So you'd almost have a book on everybody, and then you'd figure out how it is I'm going to get to this person on the basis of outside interests. So we go appeal, and you'd have to, person by person, put together the majorities that you wanted to. And that's what the legislative process is about. Some people are persuaded on the merits. Some people have no interest in the merits whatsoever. You have to go find out what their interest is prompted by.
Who ran your campaign in 1981?
1981, Joe Salima was one of the people that worked for me.
How did you know Joe Salima?
Joe I met when I was campaigning in Gloucester County. He was in Williamstown, and I met him, and he started out with me as sort of a staff guy, helping me drive around Gloucester County, which I didn't really know that well, and then ultimately worked his way up to the point of being my office manager, and he ran the campaign.
Your congressional district office manager?
Yes.
And he ran, and you entrusted him with the campaign. You thought he was sharp.
And we had a sort of a cadre of people. I mentioned George Zoffinger, Mike Perucci. We had a number of relatively young people who were not old-time political people, and that was the dynamism we brought to the campaign in the primary election in 1981, which was successful. Because politics was changing. I mean, politics was changing dramatically.
How so?
Well, the old machines were evaporating. We had gone through the process of trying to get people involved with, the McGovern approach, trying to get identified people that you give ratings 1, 2, 3, 4 in terms of the strength of their commitment. We'd also reach out to people on subject matter issues, consumer advocates, tennis rights people, environmental people, labor people, identifying those constituencies and then working hard to get them enthusiastic.
Tell me a little about the campaign of 1981. Once you won the primary and it was you against Tom Kean, how did it go? What's the story of that election?
Well, I've teased Tom over the years because I learned a lot from that campaign. One is that he went through the campaign in a very leisurely pace. I went through it in a manic way. I was getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go to plant gates. I'd be at the RCA plant gate at 6 o'clock to meet the first shift, passing out literature. And I have a campaign schedule of maybe 15 events through the course of the day. At the end of the day, we figure out how we have a campaign meeting at midnight so as to plan for the next day. I went from 172 to 156 pounds through the course of the campaign. I looked like a cadaver because I just had run myself into the ground. And at the end of the campaign, it probably was demonstrated that I was tired and just ran myself into the ground.
Whereas he
had 2 or 3 stops, maybe a day. Was always late for everything because he'd talk with people, and that was a very smart way of doing things. Subsequently, I learned to do some of that.
He was famous for not leaving an event on schedule, but for sticking around and talking to every last person who wanted to work with him.
And I was famous or infamous for being punctual to a fault. So I would be there when I was supposed to be there. He was never there when he was supposed to be there.
I'm sure you and he debated on television.
Yes.
Probably on NJN, probably beyond just NJN.
Well, the League of Women Voters were the people that really ran most of the votes in those days.
How did you do against him in debate?
Well, it depends on your perspective. I mean, I thought of myself as sharp, perhaps overly sharp. I remember on a couple of occasions I was just condescendingly nice to him. Down in South Jersey, he mispronounced one of the roads that we have down there. Said he was pleased to come down Delby Drive. And I consciously got up and said, well, I've been on Delsey Drive on a number of occasions. And the whole audience erupted in laughter and whatever. So I was a little full of myself. But he was very good. And he and I have talked about this over the years. It was the last truly civil campaign that was conducted. No negative ads, no negativity at all. And it was a pleasure. It was a good campaign.
Do you remember who you used to make your commercials in that campaign?
There was a fellow, Joe White, if I recall, who was really a radio guy for the most part, but he was one of the people who was involved. There were no people in New Jersey at that point. We didn't have a whole lot of homegrown political consultants as we do now. So there were people out there. I remember talking with David Axelrod from Chicago, which is interesting. We didn't pick him, but he was.
He must have been about 20 years old
at
the time. Do you remember election night?
I'm sorry?
Do you remember election night?
I do.
Do you remember where you were?
I think we were in Cherry Hill at the Cherry Hill Inn, if I recall correctly. It was a long night. Obviously, nobody decided what the outcome was. Nobody called the election because it was just too close to call. And it took about a month for the recount to take place. And,
what was that period like?
Just sort of frozen in limbo because nobody knew what. We had everyone working very hard. Angelo Genova is one of the people who was in charge of the recount for me, going to different counties.
He would be put in charge of a recount today by a Democrat. He's sort of the top
he
Democratic elections lawyer in the state.
He was a very young man, and I think in some respects I might be responsible for his expertise in election recounts, because that was when he first got involved in that sort of thing.
I would imagine that was an excruciating experience, waking up day after day after day, not knowing who had won the election. Yeah,
and in those days we had paper ballots in a lot more counties than we do now. And so the paper ballots had to be recounted and so on.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember how it was that you decided, okay, it's time to concede?
Well, when it was finally certified that the outcome was, as I say, 1,797 votes short out of 2.5 million, I said, well, this is over, it's over. So I just conceded.
Someone once said to me that as good as it feels to win in politics, it feels 1,000 times worse to lose. Was that a hard pill to swallow personally or not?
Well, I've always taken losses, and I've said I've lost on a couple of occasions as educational experiences, learning. I remember when I first lost in 1972 for Congress, I had my children with me at the headquarters, and they were all, as you would appreciate, very sad. On the way home, I sort of firmed them up a little bit, saying, don't be concerned about this. It's a learning experience. You learn from your errors. And so this is a good thing. And to this day, we've had conversations about how that taught them something about how to handle adversity. Because my responsibility in the losing effort is to try to comfort most of the other people who are very much intellectually and emotionally involved. So my job is not to cry. My job is to really help other people get through the difficulty of the evening.
And was that the case in '81 as well?
Yes.
You had to buck some people up after it was all
over?
Yeah,
very much so. I mean, a lot of people invest a lot of time and energy, psychic energy as well. So people, I think losing candidates, at least I am, very conscious of that.
How did you buck yourself up?
Well, I guess I've always bucked myself up in saying the best person doesn't always win, which is a little bit egotistical, but as long as I'm comfortable with what I do in a campaign, that's all that really counts. I mean, I've had one occasion when I was uncomfortable. I let a consultant talk me into something that I still to this day regret. And it was a campaign.
Go ahead.
It was a campaign ad that we ran in 1989. We can talk about it if you'd like.
I would like to get to that. Did the outcome in '81 feel legitimate to you? Did it feel like it was the honest choice?
The answer is yes. I mean, I had no reason to believe. The only thing that was troubling was something called the Ballot Security Task Force. This was a conscious effort by the National Republican Committee, with the concurrence of the State Committee, to go hire off-duty policemen and sheriff's officers in uniform to go to urban polling places with armbands and signs on the wall warning people that if they voted inappropriately, they could go to jail. And this was done consciously in minority communities. And I have no doubts that it may have influenced a number of people. After the election was over, the Democratic National Committee and the State Committee went to court and got a court order prohibiting that from ever happening again. And that order, by the way, stands to this day.
And ironically, as I was driving here to do this interview this morning, there was a big discussion about voter suppression in the 2012 presidential race, and whether some new rules on IDing voters amount to voter suppression of this sort.
Well, I mean, frankly, I'm not being overly partisan. It just seems to me over the years, Democrats have always worked to be more inclusive in terms of elections, and Republicans, some, seem to have a thought that they're better off if they can exclude people from voting.
I just got handed a list of who actually was involved in that '81 primary election. On the Republican side, in addition to Tom Kean, Pat Kramer, the mayor of Patterson.
He's become a good friend.
Has he?
Yes.
How have you?
He was always a quasi-democratic person anyway.
Was he?
He was the mayor of Patterson, very good guy, and Irish humor, good sense of collegiality, and I've actually worked with him on a number of occasions over the years.
Bo Sullivan, businessman.
Bo Sullivan, I was introduced to in the campaign. Met him on a couple of occasions. Seemed like a nice enough person. Not politically particularly astute, but well-to-do. one of the first well-to-do people that used his own money in many respects.
On the Democratic side, Ken Gibson, did he run in 81?
He did.
He did.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mayor of Newark.
Mayor of Newark.
African American.
First African American. Very solid person.
Joe Merlino, whose name has come up already.
Yeah.
Ran for.
Yeah. Good
governor.
friend. I worked closely with him. I don't think he took me too terribly seriously at that point.
As an electoral rival.
Yeah. Joe was someone whose views were framed by Trenton politics, and I think he was as naive in 81 as I was in 77.
To think that a Trenton politician could trump a congressman?
Yeah. Well, we've had a whole history of presidents of the Senate who wanted to run for governor, almost none of whom have ever been successful.
Interesting. Well, here's one. Pat Dodd, I think he was president of the Senate.
President of the Senate as well.
At a certain point in time.
Yeah.
Tommy Smith, the mayor of Jersey City, did he run in 81
Yes.
against you?
That was an interesting story. There was a political person of questionable repute. John Nero was his name. He's a restaurateur who supported Tommy Smith very lucratively, as the money would go in those days. And Tommy brought him down to Camden County and then ran his campaign. And I forget the exact numbers, but for all the money he put in, I think he got like 50 votes in Camden County. And the whole campaign with Mr. Nero was ethnic. I'm half Irish and half Italian. And so therefore he didn't think that was sufficiently full-blooded enough to command the Italian vote. And he ran a campaign ad in a newspaper that Florio doesn't like pasta in the way that he should, which of course is not true, but over and above that is somewhat irrelevant, I would think. So Tommy Smith had this fellow as his supporter and was fleeced by the fellow because he sent money down to get the votes, and they didn't get the votes.
Well, what was Tommy Smith's ethnicity?
I have no idea.
Okay.
His major claim to fame was he had a dog that appeared in his commercials. Henry Hudson was the name of the dog, and it was something. Tommy Smith and Henry Hudson were a team that were going to do good things for New Jersey.
Bill Hamilton is on the list?
Yeah, Bill Hamilton, again, another president of the Senate.
Right.
Good guy, a friend who was a reservist. He and I were co-reservists at the Naval Air Station in Lakehurst.
But you beat them all.
Yes. Largely in some respects, I think, because we were a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of what people expected out of candidates.
How so?
Well, again, the retail piece, reaching out to people, not expecting people to come to you, and people not being delivered by political organizations. Understanding that ads in newspapers was something from a different time. Didn't spend a lot of money on television, but we spent a lot of money networking people as best we could through affinity groups. Veterans, labor people, environmental people, ethnic groups. I had a large ethnic coalition. In Camden, we have a big Polish-American community. So I worked those organizations, and they brought people to the polls for us.
So Tom Kean becomes governor, and he has a tough first year. And then he shuffles his staff, and the economy picks up greatly. And by the time it's time for him to run for re-election in 85, he's pretty popular in New Jersey.
Yes.
And you sat out 85.
That's right.
Because you thought he was unbeatable?
No, I don't even think it was that. I was just involved with much of the stuff that I was doing in Washington, and I just didn't think it was time for me to run again that quickly. It's interesting. You mentioned about the campaign that Governor Kean ran. One of the interesting things, I was challenged to take a no new tax pledge, and I refused to do it because I didn't think it was responsible. Tom, and I've teased him about this as well over the years, not only took the no new tax pledge, but promised to cut taxes. And of course, I would point out, in the first 2 years, he increased taxes fairly dramatically at the urging of Alan Karcher, who was the Democratic leader at that point, for the most part. But it's interesting, the economy turned around. And the last 2 years of Tom Kaine's administration were just swelled with revenues.
The last 2 years of his first term.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's where he was able to do a whole lot of good things for teachers, education, money, and so on. So timing is everything in some respects. Can I see if I can get some water?
Sure. Do you want to take a break?
No.
Okay. So 5 Democrats lined up to run against Kaine in '85. I think John Russo, Ken Gibson, Steve Wiley.
John Degnan?
No, Degnan ran for the nomination
81.
that you won.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, that was another one that could be on this list. Talk about Degnan. Did you have a relationship with him?
I didn't, not a real relationship. I mean, I knew him. I was in the legislature when he was Attorney General. Well, he was working in the campaign staff for Governor Byrne. Always got along very formally, nicely. I had a lot of respect for him. I think he had some respect for me. So we got along well.
1985, Ken Gibson, John Russo, Steve Wiley, Bob Del Tufo, and Peter Shapiro, I think, were the 5.
Right.
You say you got involved in issues in Washington, but you also must have been looking at the political winds and deciding this is not the time.
I was. I mean, I was following it just interestingly, academically, intellectually interested in what was going on. And could see that the outcome was going to be foreordained. Peter Shapiro, a very smart young man, but it also taught me the cultural differences in New Jersey. Peter is a very, very good candidate, very articulate. But then I remember going down with Peter down to Salem County, seeing very little rapport with the people in Salem County, Cumberland County, whatever. And I've come to appreciate the fact that there's a need for some complexity in the approach that you have going around New Jersey. Because we're multiple states, multiple influences in terms of north and south, central.
When you say the need for some complexity, and Peter Shapiro was a young, dynamic,
sophisticated,
Jewish, Ivy Leaguer, sophisticated, yes.
And Salem County, the Democratic function in Salem County in those days, the big height of the year was going to the annual Muskrat dinner. So you get a sense that maybe urbane sophistication might not play everywhere in the same way.
How does one adjust oneself to that reality?
Well, first of all, you have to know the reality. You have to understand there are different ways you communicate with people. If you don't know that, and there's no reason why you should, if you've been, this is why the President of the Senate all don't succeed, because they're so wrapped up in the milieu of politics in the State House. They really get an opportunity to see the diversity of the state.
You think a congressman gets a better view of all of the complexity than a legislative leader?
Well, almost by definition, you have a bigger constituency. But again, it's the individuals. There are some individual congressmen who don't get it at all, and there are some who do.
You say that you got involved in some other issues in the 80s. What was the big, what was the focus of your work in Congress in the 80s?
Well, for the most part, it was defensive work, stopping bad things from happening. The administration came in. First thing they did was to try to undo Superfund. The woman who was in charge of the EPA almost got herself impeached. The woman who was in charge of Superfund went to jail for conflicts of interest and perjury, things of that sort. So I was doing sort of battle for the common good against the forces of what I regarded as darkness. Most of the issues I was involved with had jurisdiction at that time over the Federal Trade Commission. So the antitrust laws were not being enforced. You had more collaboration between business communities that were anti-competitive. I was holding hearings, doing a whole bunch of things. The railroads were trying to be broken up. Amtrak was going to be privatized, broken up. So I was doing full-time work, stopping bad things from happening.
And were you assuming that there would come a day when you would run again for governor?
I don't think I planned it. early on. I think I was doing what I was doing, getting to have more authority, getting to get more things done. In some respects, although I enjoyed the affirmative years of the Carter administration getting things done positively, I also appreciated the fact that the work that I did defensively during the Reagan years was important as well.
You mentioned that Alan Karcher became the de facto leader of the Democrats during the first Kane administration. What was your relationship with him?
Alan and I got along well. I think we respected each other. He was I used to tease him as well that there was no good idea, no brilliant idea that he could not carry to its illogical extreme. And he was a very smart person. We got along well. When I ran in 1989, you may recall that he had these Cheerios boxes that he called Florios, that they were squishy.
Through and through.
One of the things that it was nice, after I got elected and did some of the hard things I did, he sent me, and I should have kept it, a nice letter that was apologetic, saying, commendable, the things you've done, very commendable. You're not squishy, you're not a Florio.
That's cute. I well remember that cereal box. It was one of the cleverest little things in my 30 years of covering New Jersey politics.
Alan was clever. Alan was very creative and very, very way ahead of his time in terms of public policy.
At some point, 87, 88, you said, okay, it's time again. Mm-hmm. Do you recall making that decision, or do you recall what led you to do that?
I recall talking with people around the state, asking them what they thought. And all of the people I were very encouraging that I spoke with, and didn't appear to be a whole lot of primary opposition. In some respects, people were saying, it's your time. And of course, there's never your time that you get by default. You have to work for it. But I got a lot of good reception. And really one of the most significant things was the environmental issues. This was a period of time, the late 80s, when beaches were closed. Literally, the Jersey Shore was closed as much as it was open because people were doing testing, people were finding garbage washed up. As I say, medical waste were being disposed of inappropriately. And Jersey Shore, as you know, something that's almost a matter of religion in New Jersey. And I was being heralded as someone that had environmental skills enough to be able to cope with that. And I started making representations that if I were to be a candidate and if I were elected, I would go, because I had the knowledge, I said, to be able to deal with the problems, clean up the shore.
I think in the Democratic primary in 1989, it was you and Alan Karcher and Barbara Sigmund,
right.
Whose political lineage is pretty significant. She was the daughter of Hale Boggs, the House Majority Leader.
And very articulate, very charming.
Barbara Sigmund was, yes.
Very articulate and very charming.
Her mother would then take the father's House seat, Lindy Boggs. Yeah. And her sister, Cokie Roberts, the journalist. That was an interesting field, the three of you.
Interesting and not particularly competitive. I mean, in some respects, I didn't feel really threatened by the field, just because both people were very good, very intelligent, very articulate, but had no political organization of any sort, didn't raise a whole lot of money. So it was just not something. We were planning for the general before we probably should have been.
Who were the key people around your campaign at that point? Was Joe Salima back with you?
Yes, but less so. Doug Berman really was the person who was the campaign honcho. But we had a good campaign team of people.
How did you know Doug Berman?
I just really ran into him. He was one of the Bradley people, and I guess I ran into him in that context. Big supporter of Senator Bradley.
Uh-huh. So you had a pretty optimistic view of the primary in '89. You say you were already thinking about the general.
Yes.
There were 5 Republicans on the other side. Jim Courter, Chuck Hardwick, Bill Gormley, Carrie Edwards, and was that the year Jim Walworth? Right?
Yes, it was Jim Walworth.
Right. Yes. Who were you planning for? Who did you think it would be?
I just evaluated all the candidates, and I really didn't plan for any. I didn't know who would be there. In some respects, most of the state legislators would have been much more conversant with state policies than Jim Cotter as a congressman would have been. So I took that into account. But we were ready for whoever it is that got the nomination.
That's an interesting point that you just raised that I want to take back to '81 for a second. Tom Kean had been a legislative leader, and I guess he had dropped out of the legislature in 3 or 4 years before he ran for governor in '81. But I guess you too had some Trenton legislative experience, but most of your experience up to that point had been in Congress. Did you feel that yourself in any way at a disadvantage in terms of state issues?
No, because I consciously focused on those issues in addition to the things I was doing in Washington.
That was your homework?
That was my homework. And I consciously worked to find the Jersey dimension of my national issues. So it was not wasted effort on behalf of the state.
So jumping forward now 8 years to the Republican field, some of those men, as you point out, were pretty well versed in the state issues.
Right.
And you had to prepare yourself to go up against one of them, Carrie Edwards, for example,
yeah.
in case that were that might have put you at a little bit of a disadvantage.
Well, it would have made the race much more difficult. Carrie Edwards, Gormley, very, very smart people, very knowledgeable, would have been probably more formidable.
Hardwick knew those state issues
Hardwick
too.
as well, very formidable.
But
again, the difficulty they had was that they didn't have a statewide constituency, whereas I had, by virtue of running in the past, a statewide constituency.
That used to be the rule of thumb in New Jersey politics, that if you want to win a statewide election, you have to run once and lose.
So money now has taken the place of that. You can buy your statewide constituency intensely.
Not only that, but it seems like losing once can sort of tarnish you. Correct?
Perhaps, yeah.
Why do you think Cotter won that primary?
I think because the rest of the people were fairly moderate and Jim presented himself as more conservative. And that was the beginning of the process of the Republican Party in New Jersey becoming much more conservative-oriented, when moderate became a term of some questionable attractiveness. So you had a number of moderate people. I think Chuck Hardwick was more the conservative of the others, but Jim Cotter consciously worked at being perceived of as conservative.
I have my memories of what happened after he won the primary, but I'm interested in yours. And if you don't remember mine, I'll throw them at you. He stumbled coming out of the gate, I think,
a number of occasions.
On a number of occasions, yeah. Do you recall a particular stumble?
Well, the stumble is almost inherent in the political process on the Republican side. He was naturally conservative, but to be successful in the Republican primary, you have to be very conservative. But then to be successful in the general election, you've got to be less conservative. Trying to flip, and again, Governor Romney is going through the same process right now. It becomes difficult to do that. For example, on the gay rights issue, you may recall that he was asked about gay rights, and he stumbled on a number of occasions, wanting to obviously be attractive to extreme conservative people. He was against that, but then wanting to be more moderate, he tried to be a little of each, and that didn't work.
That is the one that I most well remember. It was the primary would have been in June. I think it was early July, and I remember a West State Street little press conference in which he said that he didn't think that homosexuals should be allowed to teach in the classroom.
Right.
And press corps, the State House press corps, couldn't quite grasp what he was saying and kept pushing back on the statement to the point where Corder just turned and ran away from the press corps.
I remember that vividly.
You do?
I do.
So do I. I was there.
Yeah. And I remember people coming to me, and again, I guess this was not the norm, I said, if a teacher teaches well, that's fine. I'm not threatened by somebody's sexuality. It's a private matter, and it's there. And if a person, they said, well, you don't want to move into a house next door to you. I said, if they're a good tenant, I don't care who lives next door to me, as long as they're a nice neighbor and a good tenant. And that was sort of contrasted, that was a fairly definitive answer, contrasted with no answer. And the same thing in a couple of other issues that we focused upon. I remember in one of the debates, one of the questions was about the environment. And Jim said, oh yes, I'm strong on the environment. And I sort of gratuitously sort of made a face, I guess, and said, give me a break. You just got rated by one of the environmental organizations as the worst environmental congressman in the New Jersey delegation. And so I sort of ridiculed that a little bit.
Was that the campaign in which your side pointed out a piece of land in South Jersey that had environmental problems and that he owned a piece of?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's the issue that I mentioned before that I was a little embarrassed by. Not so much that as the fact that we ran an ad, which against my better judgment I acquiesced to, that had a picture of Congressman Corder, and as he was talking about how he's good on the environment, his nose started to grow, a la Pinocchio.
Ah, the Pinocchio ad.
And when I saw that, I said, this is not anything I'm comfortable with. They persuaded me that it was something that was very effective. I said yes to it, and I saw it on television. I told them to pull it down. It's just degrading the whole process.
I remember traipsing across that property down in Ocean County or wherever it was that summer, and between the gay issue that he tried to retract what he had said or clarify or modify what he said, between that and what your campaign called attention to with this piece of property that was contaminated, he looked like toast by Labor Day. Is that how you remember it?
I do. It was just an example of he wasn't conversant with the state issues and the whole idea of trying to square the circle of appealing to very conservative people in the primary and moderate people. He was just not adept at that. So he paid a price for that, I suspect. Although over the years, he and I have talked on a number of occasions, and he went on to be very wealthy in the business section. So we sometimes talk about who really won and who really lost.
Is he still with IDT in
I think
Newark?
he is. I think he is. Yes.
Yeah. He's not on the state scene anymore. You don't see him at events.
He's got into more productive things.
Okay. Now that campaign is percolating in my memory, I recall that I did lengthy interviews with both wives of the candidates that year, and you had a new wife,
yes.
Lucinda. When did you and she get married?
1988.
88.
Right.
And his wife was Carmen Corder, two lovely women who enhanced the men at their sides, I would say. How did Lucinda enjoy the 89 campaign?
Well, it was a whole new life for her. She was a teacher, elementary school teacher, and sort of we got wrapped up in this fairly quickly. And she was obviously a big asset going out with me. And people said she warmed me up a little bit, which I suspect needed a little bit of. But it was an interesting thing. She was very, very good, made a nice presentation, talked about things that she was interested in, child literacy, education, things of that sort.
What were October or September and October like that year? Just playing defense, hold the lead? No,
we were fairly comfortable the way things were going, so we were just trying to maximize turnout, particularly in the urban areas. Because what happened in 1981 was that notwithstanding Democrat versus Republican, the turnout was not that great in the urban areas. So we focused on the urban areas, get turnout, and the turnout was good.
What did you do? You campaigned in the cities?
A lot of retail. A lot of retail. Yeah.
Doug Berman was the campaign manager.
Right.
Who else was key in that campaign?
Well, there were a whole lot of people, many of the same people from '81 were around. George Zoffinger was very much involved. Bob Del Tufo was involved. Angelo Genova. A whole lot of people who have become friends and supporters were very actively involved.
So you knew all fall you were going to win that election?
I'm sorry?
You knew all fall that you were going to win that election?
Well, you never know, but I mean, there's a comfort level that things are going well.
Do you recall election night, 1989?
I do.
Where were you?
I do. I think we were in New Brunswick, the East Brunswick, Hilton, the Ramada, whatever it was at that time.
Right.
And it was a nice feeling.
You had been preparing for that night for 15 years. Must have been a nice feeling.
Well, I mean, it was obviously as a pleasant feeling, but I immediately started thinking about the job. Starting to form the transition team. Actually, a couple of days before, we had started to give some talk to that.
Before the election?
Yeah, before the election. General outlines of what we wanted to do, Carl Van Horn was somebody who was very helpful to me. Brenda Bacon was somebody who was very helpful to me on the substantive side. So I had already switched gears and was thinking about how we were going to address the specific issues that we had to deal with.